Peter Gleeson, Editor-in-Chief of the Sunday Mail, Queensland's largest circulating newspaper. Thank you very much for agreeing to an interview with me on Church and State.
It's a pleasure.
Now, tell me a bit about your history. A lot of people, some people may have heard of you, some people may not. When exactly did you get into newspapers and journalism?
So it was 1981. I was appointed as a cadet reporter at the Daily Examiner in Grafton, which is a beautiful little part of Australia down there in northern New South Wales. Yep. I was only 17 at the time. I was doing the Greyhound form for the local paper since I was about 14. So I had a pretty fundamental grasp of English and of course spelling. And I was in year 11 at Grafton High, and I was doing okay. It wasn't going to be a train wreck, the HSC, but it was definitely going to be challenging in some of those non-English or history subjects. Sure. I was going to struggle, and a very good friend of mine, Brett Ney, spotted an advertisement in the local paper for a cadet journalist, and I applied. I was lucky to have some terrific references. I had a reference from Bill Wiley, the former member for Clarence, and Bill Doherty, the former mayor, who were good friends of my dad.
Okay.
So I was very thankful that my dad was able to, who was friends with those guys, was able to get those references. And then I went in for an interview with Loretta Godby. Loretta was the then editor. I think there were 40-odd applicants, and they hired myself straight out of school in year 11, and a guy called David Bancroft, who went on to edit the Daily Examiner many years later. And I remember when Loretta offered me the job, she said that she was concerned that I wouldn't be completing my HSC. And I then said, well, look, it's not a concern for me. If you want me to go to TAFE and complete my secondary education, I'm prepared to do that. That was never necessary. So I got thrown in at the deep end. When you're 17 and you're a cadet on a local daily like that, you get to pretty well do everything. Wow. And so I was covering Grafton City Council before I was even allowed to vote.
Wow.
Which was extraordinary. And there was a mayor back at the time, and his name was Gordon Jabor. And Gordon was a terrific fellow. He's passed on now, but I remember, we'd finish so the meetings were Monday nights, so you'd go along at 7 o'clock or 7:30 when they started, and pretty well you'd go through till about 11 o'clock, and I'd have copious amounts of notes, and I'd have the big agenda there, and then Gordon would invite a few people upstairs to his mayoral chambers, and invariably he'd break out the Chivas Regal at the end of that meeting, and I can remember a couple of times where I did succumb to the enticements of a little Chivas, even though I was only 18. Yeah. Well, of course, I think I might have been 18 at the time, but it was a great training ground, and I remember sort of in that first 6 months that I was in the job, Grafton was hit by a massive flood. Wow. And so I was so you'd cover a flood, you'd cover council, you'd cover the local race meeting, you'd cover car accidents, and there was never a dull moment, and it was a terrific way to be grounded in journalism. And I sometimes lament the fact that we don't take youngsters at that age anymore, where it is very much sink or swim, but you do learn very quickly on the job. But nowadays it's much more about taking university graduates, usually around the sort of 20, 21 age mark, and sure they've had they've been taught in the fundamentals and basics of journalism, but I don't think there's any replacement for or substitute for learning on the job.
How's your greyhound betting?
Oh,
well served by those days?
Well, it was, and I remember I used to do a lot of greyhound form back then, and I still do. I still enjoy I still enjoy the greyhounds. I own greyhounds. I've owned greyhounds for a long time. I owned a couple of good ones with a few mates.
Yeah.
Most recently, a little bitch called Black Audit, who won the Grafton Cup in 2015, trained by my mother. And so the greyhounds have always been a source of great joy for me. And, it was a very upsetting time when Mike Baird banned the greyhounds last year. He subsequently reversed that decision, which I think was the right decision. But they always hold a soft spot for me because in many ways they helped me to get my job because I was doing the form when I was sort of 14 and 15. So,
what did your dad do for a living?
He was a wharfie. He was a waterside wharfie in Port Kembla.
And so did he know politicians because he was in the union?
No, not necessarily. No, I just think Dad was he's a bit of a knockabout. He was a well-known guy around Grafton.
Yeah.
And, he liked the greyhounds. He liked to punt on the horses. And, Billy, the Dohertys are a big family around Grafton. So he knew the Dohertys. He knew Billy in particular. He knew George. I think George Wiley ran the local pub down there, one of the local pubs.
Yeah.
But yeah, Dad was a wharfie. So I was born in Wollongong, and grew up there till I was about 14 or 15. Then we moved back to Grafton.
Yeah.
Because that's where Dad and Mum met, and so Dad got sick in Wollongong. And they decided that they'd move back, and that was I was about 14 or 15. So that was in, it would have been about 1978, 79.
Yep.
Yeah, moved back to Grafton, and I went straight into year 8.
Wow.
Get rid of that.
Now, you've been in the journalism since the early 80s.
Correct.
So you covered, I believe, the Cowper bus tragedy.
Yeah.
What was your involvement in reporting? Were you on the scene?
Correct. Wow. So what happened was we were in the Sun newsroom back in the late 80s. I was a graded reporter there, and we got that was back in the days when you'd get notification about stories from AAP over the wire. I'd come through, and we established. I used to start at 5 a.m. because we were an afternoon daily, and we established that there was a bad bus crash at Cowper. So we flew down to a little place called Chatsworth Island, and got some. Then made our way out to the crash site, which was very confronting, as you could imagine.
So for those people who aren't old enough, and I don't remember it from the news in those times, but my understanding of it is a truck crossed the wrong side of the road, tore down one side of a jam-packed bus, and basically everybody on that side of the bus, 20 people were killed. Yeah. And everybody else was very, very... So there was carnage and wreckage everywhere.
I think there were 38. I stand corrected, but I do remember that it was a significant number.
Okay.
And it happened at 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. There's suggestions that one of the drivers fell asleep, and it was truck into big bus. And
so what was covering that like?
Oh, it was confronting. And I remember we got back to Brisbane pretty quickly. I think we got back at around so we were on site at around 7:30, 8 o'clock. We were back at Archerfield by about 9:30, and I was probably back in the office about 10:30. So back in the days when we used to run multiple editions, and I think that was one of the days in my career that I remember the most, because we ran 6 editions that day. We normally run 3.
Wow.
And we just kept pumping out stories and front pages. And I used to often go to a pub next door, the Empire, where my colleagues would often drink. And, nowadays you'd think, well, okay, there probably should have been a little bit of post-traumatic counselling. my post-traumatic counselling that day was to go to the pub and pretty well get sloshed, because it was very, it was almost surreal to think that this was, but it was certainly the biggest story I'd ever covered as a reporter. I did cover Beaconsfield, the mining tragedy, which was also extraordinary for me. But so we got back, and then I just kept writing to the point where by sort of 4 o'clock that afternoon, I think we were about to do our final edition. You were running on adrenaline and getting updates on how many people had died and so forth. And then I remember walking out at about sort of 4:30 and going next door into the Empire Hotel and having a few drinks, and it was a very sort of surreal, confronting, sobering experience. But I guess one of those situations where, as a news reporter, you deal with what's in front of you.
Did you cry?
No, but I felt emotional. I certainly felt. I felt sad. I felt very sad for how destructive the loss of life was, and you could see that this was an incredibly. It was like a war zone. I mean, it was. There were paramedics everywhere. I remember thinking that it was a bit like when I was in Grafton in my first year as a reporter. There was a tragic accident in Almara, which is just down from Cowper, where a bus and it was a Tarago type vehicle being driven by a priest went into a tree mid-afternoon. A guy called Ron Englert, who was a photographer, him and I went down there, and there were 8 killed in that, and that was a similar sort of sickening feeling, and they were Korean or they were Asian orphans. These kids, and I remember it very, very well because the driver was a priest, and he went into this tree, and he was wedged, and he subsequently lost both his legs. But the North Coast Rescue Helicopter Service, so this would have been 1981, had just been commissioned. Like literally 2 months earlier. Wow. And so they got a chopper and they airlifted this priest out from his situation back to the Grafton Hospital, which was probably only 3 or 4 minutes in the chopper. But in a car it would have taken 20 minutes. Yeah. And in an ambulance. And I remember there was a doctor, Dr. Barnett was his name, and he was the first sort of responder at the hospital. And of course the guy went in and had surgery, and he lost both his legs because they were crumpled. And I remember saying to Dr. Barnett a few months later, if the chopper wasn't commissioned, would he have survived? And he said no, wow. He would have died. He would have died before he got to hospital because of loss of blood. So I remember that. And so there were similarities between, the confronting nature of Almara and the confronting nature of Cowper. Yeah. And I still go to Grafton quite regularly because it's my hometown, and I go past those spots where those 2 accidents happen, and I invariably think about it.
Yeah. Well, in the next segment, let's talk more about what's changed in the last 3 decades in journalism as well as the rest of the world.
Sure.
Thanks for watching. If you really enjoyed that video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Have a look at this great video next, and check out the website for even more interesting articles and episodes later.